you for joining us for today's virtual workshop on performing well in an interview. My name is Maddie McNabb, and I am the Internship Coordinator in the University Career Center. I will be moderating today's workshop. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A section, and we will answer them throughout the workshop. This event is being recorded and will be available on our website along with our previous workshops. Now let's meet today's presenter, Mallory Newby, a career coach and assistant director in the UCC.
Thank you, Maddie, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today's workshop on interviewing like a star. As you mentioned, we'll focus on the elements of effective interviews, and for the learning outcomes specifically, we'll be breaking down what an interview really is, the various types of interviews, and then we'll dive in more to the specifics of effectively answering interview questions, like 3 questions you should always be prepared to answer in an interview, with one of those being tell me about yourself, and how to do so successfully by practicing your elevator pitch. And then we'll look at the S.T.A.R technique for answering behavioral questions, and then finally post-interview etiquette and how to follow up with your interviewer. So we'll have some time throughout today's workshop to answer your questions, but then we're going to leave some time at the end for final thoughts. And so my goal for you is at the end of this workshop to feel better about how to effectively navigate the interview process from pre-interview to post-interview like a star. All right, so let's get started. What is an interview? So interviews are basically a conversation between the interviewer and the candidate so that both parties can learn more about each other for the purpose of identifying a potential employment fit. And so think about it. You and the interviewer each have a need. You're there because you want to show the employer that you have the skills and that you're a good fit for the job, and the interviewer needs to identify the right person for the position. Keep in mind, I think it's important to know that you're not the only one there to be interviewed. You need to assess whether or not it's a good fit for you as well. So often we're really nervous about being judged and being scrutinized and saying the right things. But from this standpoint, you also need to assess whether or not this is a good fit for you. And I think that helps to curb some nerves and also look at it from a different lens. So before we jump into the question part and all of that good stuff, we'll look at the 4 elements of an effective interview, and today's presentation is going to center on these. Number 1 is planning and preparation. Once you've been invited for an interview, you need to begin to plan and prepare by reviewing what you know about the position, the organization, and what your research shows you about that workplace and the culture. So be sure to study the job description extensively so that you're well versed in the role and you have a good focus on where to highlight your skills and qualifications during the interview. Preparation and planning is essential to an effective interview. And some specific things that you can do to get prepared, in addition to looking at the company and the job description, is maybe research some other employees. And you can do that through LinkedIn. Find out who is on the hiring committee. Look at their LinkedIn bios and look at the company's page. Through that, you can research industry appropriate clothing, and then you might even also want to test drive to the location if you have an in-person interview to know where you're going to go and park in advance. So in addition to all of these research pieces to the job, review your own resume, read over that, look at your cover letter, and go over your professional experiences so that you're going to feel most comfortable discussing your qualifications. So some good specific exercises to work with and getting through this planning and preparation process. Write down 3 to 5 specific things about that company and the position that make it a great fit for you. What is it about it that really appeals to you? Make note of that. And then identify 3 to 5 skills and experiences that make you perfect for the job. These are all very good things to help you feel confident about your skills and qualifications, as well as knowing about what they're looking for and what their organization is about. And also you might want to think about what are some challenges that you might face. So if you don't have a lot of experience in one piece of that job, start to think about some potential questions that interviewer might have about your background and how you plan to discuss those in the interview. And then you're also going to want to, through your research, come up with some questions of your own that you have about the company or the position so that you can ask that interviewer when that question comes up. So next, the second element of effective interviews is body language and your professional attire. So one of the most important aspects of communication is body language. Now during your interview, you want to, smile politely, sit up straight, and even lean slightly forward to indicate your interest in the job. And so eye contact is also a piece of that. You're going to want to maintain eye contact without staring, but making sure that when you speak to the interviewer, you're looking at them and making eye contact. Also, keep in mind your hand gestures. So if you're someone who uses your hands to speak and you can get a little out of hand with that, you could bring with you one of those portfolios or a notebook to hold on to and keep your hands occupied. But keep all of the interviewers' attention on what you're saying and not distracted by what you're doing. And so that also goes into what you decide to wear. So when you're doing research and you're looking online, check out and see if you can find any photos to see what that company culture is like. And if you're not sure, always opt for business professional and make sure what you're wearing fits properly, is clean, and is in line with that role. So next, obviously, is questions and answers and mastering these elements like a star. So most of the content today that we'll get into will cover this in great detail. And we'll look at 3 questions you need to be prepared to answer, along with the elevator pitch, and then the behavioral questions using STAR technique. But looking at number 4, the next element is the follow-up. So this is often an element that gets forgotten. Post-interview, be sure to follow up with a thank you note within 24 hours. And this will likely be in the form of an email in order to get that thank you over within the time frame. But you might want to also send a thank you letter in the mail, and that's just rare. It'll help you stand out even more. But be sure within 24 hours to send them a thank you note, and we'll look at some more tips on that towards the end of the workshop. So I know we just kind of got started, but let's see. We'll look at actually 6 common types of interviews, and then we'll pause for some questions. All right. So these are some of the common types of interviews that you're going to see and what you might be asked to participate in as a first step in the interview process. So the first is a telephone interview. And now a phone call is typically a first round screening to see if you're a good fit and to see if they want to invite you in for an in-person interview. So nailing this is key. Phone interviews are typically shorter, anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. And what they do is they help to narrow the applicant pool down quickly. And so these can be challenging because you can't read body language and you can't build rapport as easily as you can in person. But you'll want to prepare for these just as you would with an in-person interview, with just some key adjustments for that phone format, such as, make sure that you're in a quiet place without distractions, make sure that you're speaking clearly and loudly, and ensuring that you're communicating good energy and enthusiasm while you're speaking. Since they can't see you, you want to project that in your voice. And, there are some advantages to it as well. So you can have your resume out in front of you, along with a copy of the job description, and then maybe some of those talking points that we talked about writing down during your planning and preparation for the phone interview. Next, number 2 is the video interviews, which takes the phone screening interview to the next level. And so they're becoming a regular part of the job application process for many companies. And especially now with many of us working from home, expect to see this one as the most common interview type that you might be asked to complete at this stage. So you'll prepare just as you would for other formats. However, there are some additional considerations here. So from choosing the right on-screen look, make sure you're still dressed the part and from head to toe, because the last thing you want is to have technical issues and have to get up and fix your equipment. Then you don't have any pants on, or you're wearing, your Bermuda shorts. Make sure that you're dressed the part from head to toe. And then also make sure your tech systems are working, and do a practice run before you actually use your software. And then another tip is to make sure that you look into the actual camera when you're speaking rather than the person on the screen. And that's just going to help you to project that eye contact. So we did a full workshop on how to put your best face forward in a video interview. So really want to encourage you to check that out on our website that we'll show here at the end. Number 3, this one is not as well known, but becoming very popular, and that's the recorded interview. And you might see this called a one-way video interview, and they sometimes are replacing the phone interview, and it is a first step in screening job candidates, okay? So the concept is simple. You'll likely receive an email that you've been selected to participate in a recorded interview where you're asked some predetermined questions, and then you record yourself answering these questions to send back to the interviewer for a review. There are some advantages in that you often will get several tries to record your answers before you finalize those, but the key here is to read and follow the instructions very carefully. Make sure that you meet the deadline to get the interview submitted. And like the video interview, just make sure that your technology is working properly and that your background is professional and you're dressed the part and you're not distracting from your answers. All right, number 4, this is the one-on-one interview and is traditionally the most popular interview format. And this is where you would go into the organization, or you might even meet at a neutral location like a coffee shop to meet with that person to discuss the position. So often this may be a second interview after a phone or a video screen, or it might be the first interview that you have with the company. Either way, this interview is usually a bit longer, and it might include a tour of the location, which gives you an opportunity to experience the company culture firsthand and see where you might be working. So some tips here: just make sure you arrive early. That's 10 to 15 minutes before the start of the interview. Although I do suggest you might want to actually arrive on location and find that you get on site earlier than that. Just make sure not to go into the office too early, because that can kind of pressure the interviewer to meet with you before your scheduled time slot. So, if you drove to the interview, maybe wait in your car a little bit, go over your talking points, or wait in a coffee shop. Just don't get too hyped up on caffeine, but make sure that you are there and greeting the interviewer 10 to 15 minutes before the start. And number 5, the panel or the committee interview. And this one often sparks a lot of nerves because you're not only meeting with one interviewer, but could be 4 or 5 at a time. And typically, panel of interviewers will represent multiple areas of the company. So each representative will consider you through a different lens. So, for example, if you're interviewing at a tech company for a project management role, your panel might include the department manager, an HR manager, and the team leads from specific departments in those that you might be working with on a daily basis. Because your interviewers come from different backgrounds and roles, each one will consider your resume and responses a little differently. So the department manager might be most interested in your project management background, while an engineering supervisor probably wants to hear more about your technical experience. So this is why they have different people, because they're all assessing different areas. So to prepare for this kind of interview, just simply ask your company contact, whoever reached out to you to arrange the interview, can you tell me a little bit more about the panel I'll be meeting with? And more than likely, they'll be able to give you their names, their titles. But if you don't get that information on the day of the interview, in the initial introductions with the panel, try and write down their name and their role so that you have that information, and then you can engage with your interviewers personally, making eye contact with each of the panel members and not just answering to one person, because often we see one face that looks very friendly, and even though another person asks us a question, we look at that one person. Share eye contact between the panel. And lastly, a presentation interview, which is usually a second or maybe a third step in the interview process. And this format is an opportunity for the interviewers to see you demonstrate your skills and qualifications in action. So giving a presentation allows you to share your public speaking skills, your knowledge of a specific topic, your creativity, your ability to stay calm under pressure. And so this is a good opportunity. It's a great chance for you to show your skills in action. And so some tips to acing this type of interview is to get the expectations up front. Don't be afraid to ask that hiring manager questions about the presentation interview. So clarify the topic, the time limit, and then even see what technology you'll have access to. So another important element is also to know your audience. And so if you can find out about the audience that you'll be presenting to in terms of, will they be your colleagues? Are they your bosses or potential clients? And then be sure to tailor your message to that audience. And then once you've identified those specs, prepare your visual aids and practice. So those are the 6 common types of interviews, but I do want to note that depending on your targeted industry, it is very likely that an employer will use multiple of the interview formats throughout the process. So some of the first 3 of the telephone, the video, the recorded interview, those are usually first steps. And then the last 3 are more of the final stages in narrowing down the candidate pool. So before we get into preparing your answer to some of these interview questions, Maddie, do we have any questions about the elements of interviews or the common types?
We do. The first question, how many questions should I have prepared at the end for the employer?
Great question, because in your research, you want to come up with a lot, because chances are once you get into that interview, you're going to have maybe 3 questions that you've had written down, and they're going to explain it. They're already going to explain it. You're going to say, dang it, that was one of my questions. So in terms of a magic number, I wouldn't say that there's a specific number, but I would say have at least 10 on hand, because I'm someone who comes over prepared. Have at least, I'd say 10, because chances are they're gonna answer some of the ones that you have written down. And that doesn't mean that you're gonna ask all 10, but you're gonna have some planned in advance. And also, as you are in the interview, remember it's a conversation. So if something comes up during the interview, make note of it and ask it, but you definitely want to have more than 3 planned in advance, because I can guarantee you that they'll answer some of those that you had prepared.
Thank you. The next question is, during a panel interview, who do I look at when I'm answering a question asked by one of the panelists?
So like we were talking about with the panel interviews, they're going to be typically representing different areas. So if one person asks a specific question, I would answer their question. and make sure that I'm looking at them as I respond. But it's a good idea to kind of work the room as well. So, don't focus in on one person and one person alone, but make sure that you're engaging the group with eye contact. And so it just kind of depends too. So if someone is asking a question, I might start out by looking at them, but as the next person asking questions, I'm going to look at them. You just kind of vary your eye contact. I've been involved in interviews where people will only look at like one person, and it's very distracting to the group. So don't get hung up so much on who should I be looking at, but be natural, answer the question from that panelist, and make sure that you engage with the group as well. Good question.
We have a couple more. During the time for my questions, is it okay to ask the interviewer for their opinion, such as what do you like most about working here?
Absolutely. And later in a few slides, I was going to talk a little bit more about preparing your questions in more detail, but you're going to want to have specific questions about the job, but there are really good questions that you can ask based on their experience. So getting an idea of what they like about working there, and that all goes into finding out about the culture and what are some things that you can't necessarily find in the job description or online. And so it's totally a good thing to ask them about what they like about the company, what challenges they've had. You can ask personal questions, just make sure they relate to the company and the position.
Thank you. The last one is, are there any questions that employers are not allowed to ask interviewees, and how should I respond if they ask me one of those questions?
And that's a really good question, because typically, your interviews, they're going to be professionals, and so if they are within human resources, they should know what questions they can ask and what they can't. But illegal interview questions are going to be anything that centers on race, religion, your national origin, birthplace, age, disability, family status, and things like that. So if something comes up that relates around those protected areas, then you absolutely have a right to say, I'm sorry, that question is not related to this position, and I don't feel comfortable answering that. And that can be very uncomfortable, especially during an interview when we feel obligated to respond. But before you go into an interview, it's a good idea to look up what are illegal interview questions, and you'll see that they fall into these categories, and feel absolutely comfortable with saying that this is not a question I feel comfortable answering. And it's usually a good indication that if they're asking you illegal interview questions, that it may not be a good company for you. They may not be operating in ways that they should be operating. So that's a good indication and a red flag as to whether or not it would be a good fit for you.
Thank you, Mallory. That's all the questions we have for now.
All right, thanks, Maddie. Great question. So let's look at preparing for these 3 interview questions. And so you can't control what questions that will be asked of you during an interview. And remember that a successful interview is a natural conversation. However, there are still a few questions that you need to practice before the interview. And these questions are, tell me about yourself. Why are you interested in this position? And do you have any questions for me or for us? So in the next slide, we're going to look at the first one and the elevator pitch. But for the second question, why are you interested in this position? If you properly prepare for your interview using some of the planning and preparation exercises that we discussed earlier, you should be easily able to communicate to them specifically why you're interested in the position. So before you go to that interview, remember to write down 3 to 5 specific things about the organization and the position that make it a great fit, as well as 3 to 5 key skills and experiences that make you perfect for the job. So another element to an effective interview is listening. So listen to the interviewer as they discuss the organization and the position. And while you're in the interview, if you have with you a notebook or one of those nice portfolios with some paper, if they say something that's interesting or that you have a question, jot that down so that you can ask that question when they ask you, do you have any questions for us? Or some specific things that really excite you about the position. So just to touch on the third question, do you have any questions for us? Never be that person that says, no, I don't think I have any questions. Always have some questions prepared in advance to ask the interviewers. And so likewise, when you engage in that effective planning and preparation, you'll come up with some things that interest you based on your research or that you're interested in learning more about. So make note of those. And then, of course, never ask about salary or benefits at this stage in the interview process, but instead look at some specific questions that you want to have answered. And like I said, be prepared that some of those questions may be explained in the interview process, before you have a chance to ask them. So have plenty prepared in advance. And if you're having troubles coming up with questions, do some research, and you can simply Google questions to ask in an interview. And I always share this with my students. I think there's a list of 51 that I'll share, and they have some really good ideas to help you in formulating questions. But one question I will say that you should always ask, I call it the golden question, okay? Be sure to always ask, what is the next step in the hiring process? And so this is kind of the polite way of saying, am I going to hear from you or not? When am I going to know? So what is the next step in the hiring process? And this is so you can determine what the timeline looks like. Is there going to be a second interview? What's the process? And then you have an idea of what to expect in terms of the communication and the timeline after you leave the interview. All right, so the first question I wanted to dedicate this slide to is can you tell me about yourself? This is definitely one you need to be prepared to answer and have practice before you show up for the interview. This question sets the tone for the rest of the interview. And I have read somewhere that this question is the most common interview question, and it is also the most poorly answered. And that's because many people will approach this question from a personal position. And so this is not where you discuss, personal details such as age, family status, hobbies, where you grew up, or your confessions from the past. The interviewer wants to know who you are professionally, what you've accomplished, and what makes you qualified for the position. So when we talk about those illegal interview questions, sometimes this is where people give up information that they don't have to provide, such as their age, such as their family situation. So keep it professional, and that's where we're gonna look at the elevator pitch. Whether you're preparing for an interview, you're going to a networking event, being able to quickly communicate who you are, what you do, and the value that you bring to an organization is a must-have skill. So an elevator pitch is a short, it's 30 to 45 seconds professional introduction. And so the term, if you're not familiar with the term elevator pitch, comes from the time it would take to answer the question, who are you, during an elevator ride, okay? So your pitch should be thorough yet concise breakdown of your professional background. So how do you effectively navigate this part of the interview? We'll look at some tips for crafting an elevator pitch and some of the areas that you should cover in your professional introduction. which include your academic background, your experience, skills and strengths, and career goals. So for academics, discuss your university, where you go to school, the degree that you're pursuing, the year of study that you're in, and maybe even some relevant coursework. With experience, focus on your most relevant experiences. So you don't have to tell them everything you've ever done, but you might want to include the relevant ones. It could be leadership roles, internships, volunteering, or student organizations. And then you should also include relevant skills and strengths that make you a good fit for the position. And then tie this all in with your career goals. So discuss the skills and experiences that you're most interested in developing through this opportunity, and express enthusiasm in that position, and how that position will help you towards achieving your career goals. So, and then finally, you're going to want to practice this and practice this and practice this so that you feel confident when telling the interviewer about yourself. So let me give you an example. We'll put all these pieces together and I'll show you kind of what this would look like. So they ask you, can you tell me about yourself? So you might say, I'm in my 3rd year of study at the University of Louisville, majoring in psychology, and I'm interested in teaching careers. I completed 6 credit hours focusing on adolescent cognitive development, and I recently completed a course in effective instructional methods. I volunteered as a teacher's assistant this semester, and I worked with special education students. And so this experience affirmed my interest in teaching, and I've discovered that my ability to problem solve and effectively communicate with children of special needs help them succeed in the classroom. I can also speak and write Spanish, which allows me to communicate with bilingual students. And I have honed my leadership and time management skills to help motivate others to stay on task when completing assignments. I enjoy the classroom environment, and I'm excited to begin my career in education. I'm interested in lesson plan development, gaining classroom experience, and pursuing my Kentucky teacher certification in the next 12 months. So in that piece, you talked about where you're going to school, what classes that you've taken that relate to a position in teaching or education, and some of these skills that would make you a competitive candidate, so being bilingual, and then expressing enthusiasm for what this position is going to do for you in your career. So that's an example that you might want to consider, but just make sure that your elevator pitch addresses those elements. And you don't want to sound rehearsed, but you do want to make sure you cover those areas and that you sound confident, natural, and prepared for the interview. So we're going to jump into the STAR technique in just a bit, but before we do that, I'll just pause again to see if there's any questions, and if not, we'll keep rolling.
Yes, there are more questions.
Oh, great.
Can I reach out to my career coach to discuss how I can practice for an interview?
Absolutely. One of the things that we do is help with preparing for interviews. So whether that's a mock interview, we can do that with you and also give you resources to help plan and prepare. And then we used to have a software, and we're in the works of getting some new software to help with interview practice as well. So be on the lookout for that. But you can absolutely reach out to your career coach for assistance with your interview preparation.
The next one is, when is the best time to ask about pay, vacation, and other benefits?
Ooh, well, in our culture, it is not a good practice to bring up those types of questions until you have been extended an offer, okay? So you might find that in the pre-screening, so you have a phone interview or during your in-person interview, they ask you what you expect to make, and they might tell you, but you don't approach that question until it has been addressed by the interviewer or you're given an offer. And at that point, you can get more information on the benefits, look at what does their health insurance cost you? What do those premiums look like? And you can negotiate, but you never want to ask, how much does this position pay, or what's the vacation? Because it's very presumptuous and they haven't expressed an interest yet in offering you that position. They're still assessing whether or not you're a good fit. And so it is not a good practice to do that during an interview.
Thank you, Mallory. Our last question comes from a student who is re-entering the workforce after a long break because of an accident that left them quadriplegic. And they're looking for any extra recommendations or tips for their specific career search.
Okay, so for navigating interviews and discussing anything in particular, or can you read that again?
Yes, sorry. The student is looking for just any recommendations around the challenges that they'll find in their career search due to the long break that they had out of the workforce, but also their physical disability.
Yeah, so if you've been out of the workforce for a long time, it does make it more challenging to call upon specific or recent experience, but being a student is also somewhat of a career. So feel free to talk about, like we mentioned in the elevator pitch, coursework that you've taken and projects that you've done, because that is still meaningful experiences that you can use to share to that interviewer. So even though you maybe haven't been working recently, if you're in school, that is essentially now your career. And in terms of any of the challenges that may come up with disabilities, employers are able to make, with specific positions, accommodations. And so you'll often, you might want to do some research in advance to find out about that company and look at that job description to see what is that statement down at the bottom, because you'll see, the equal employment opportunity posting and then also the accommodation section. So it would be good to look at that in advance and kind of determine what that looks like. Also looking at the company, but also too, and I can't say specifically or know exactly what this unique situation is like, but a lot of times I've worked with students who also work with counselors who work specifically in that area. So I'm trying to think of, like vocational rehab and some other areas that dedicate themselves specifically to that process. So I would encourage the student also to connect with your career coach so that we can talk with you more individually and kind of look at map out some options and some starting points. But that's a very good question.
Thank you, Mallory. Our director, Bill Fletcher, also commented that you might be able to use a different type of resume, i.e. a functional resume, to de-emphasize employment gaps. But otherwise, that's all the questions we have for now.
Thank you for that addition, Bill. All right, we'll get into the behavioral interview questions, because this is what this is going to focus on, is the S.T.A.R technique. And behavioral interviewing is the most widely used method of job interviewing. Okay, so this approach is based on the belief that past performance is the best predictor of future behavior. And so with this types of questions, you will not be asked hypothetical questions about how you would handle a situation if confronted with it in the future. Instead, you'll be asked how you did handle a specific situation when you encountered it in the past. So keep in mind that employers are not interested in what you should have done or what you will do next time. They want to know what you actually did. And so you should try to keep your answers in that manner. Now, we'll talk about that in just a second, but behavioral interview questions are easy to recognize because they often have these, telltale openings like tell me about a time when you, or describe a situation when you were faced with a problem. Tell me how you approached a situation. And then, or it could be share with me an instance in which you demonstrated ... So these type of questions require you to tell stories from your past. And so these stories will be evaluated for evidence of your, competence in certain areas. So leadership, teamwork, personal skills, that kind of thing. So that is what these questions are looking to assess. And answering these types of questions is best done through the STAR technique. And most people express some disdain for these types of questions. So we're going to look at how to answer these questions like a STAR. And so thinking of a fitting example for your response is just the beginning. You also need to share details in a compelling and easy to understand way without rambling. And I think that's where a lot of times people aren't really sure how to structure their response to these. And that's what the STAR method enables you to do. So it's helpful because it provides a simple framework for helping you to tell a meaningful story about a previous work experience. So let's look at that. So STAR is an acronym and it stands for situation, task, action, and result. The situation is where you're going to set the scene and you're going to give the necessary examples or the necessary details for your example. The task describes what your responsibility was in that situation, and then the action explains exactly what steps you took to address it. And then importantly here is the result. So you want to share what outcomes your actions achieved. So by using these 4 components to shape your story, it's much easier to share a focused answer. And you're going to provide the interviewer with a digestible but compelling narrative of what you did. They can then follow along, and then they're going to be able to determine based on your answer how well you might do in that job. So the STAR method is meant to be simple because, talking about rambling, sometimes people provide too much detail and, they might give too much situation and background. You want to focus on just 1 or 2 sentences for each letter of the acronym. I'm going to show you an example in just a few minutes, but before we do that, we'll break them down to just a bit more detail. So another step to consider in your planning and preparation before the interview is to try and think about, what the job, what the position entails, and some similar situations you may have encountered in your experience. So it's a really good idea to brainstorm on some cases that you might be able to use so that you can effectively answer these beforehand. So, think about a few examples of some successes that you've had in your previous jobs, in your school, volunteer, and then think about how to discuss that using the STAR framework. So if you're struggling during the interview to come up with an example that fits, don't be afraid to ask for a minute, to gather your thoughts. It is okay to take a few seconds to think about crafting your response rather than just, rambling and hoping that your answer works for the question. So, try and brainstorm and think about these successes, maybe challenges that you've been faced with. And that's where, when you're doing your research and your planning and preparation, where you might think about what questions they might ask you. And so your answer should have each of these elements. So let's look at them in just a bit more detail here. For the situation, you're going to really talk about the context of your experience. So this is where you're laying out the scene, and you don't have to give too much detail. Remember, it's 1 or 2 sentences. Your goal here is to paint a clear picture of the situation you were in and emphasize, the challenges so that the result you touch on later seems that much more profound. Keep things concise and focus on what is relevant to your story. You're going to include your position, maybe the company you were with, and your primary responsibilities. Now for the task, you want to highlight the task here. So you're telling this story for a reason, because you had some sort of, core involvement in it. This is the part of your answer when you make the interviewer understand exactly where you fit in. So, and this can easily get confused with the action portion, which is next, but this piece is dedicated to giving the specifics of what your responsibilities were in that particular scenario. So we'll look at an example, but it could be an objective that was set for you for that position or your role. And then, think about what were you to initiate, or what was the assignment? What did you need to accomplish? What was that obstacle that you may had to overcome? Now the action, this is where you give the interviewer a sense of what your role was. So what you did, what steps that you took to reach that goal or solve that problem. And, resist the urge to give like a vague, broad answer. So I worked hard on it. I did some research. You want to get specific. And this is your chance to really showcase your contribution. And it's worthy of the specifics. So dig in deep and make sure that you give enough information about exactly what you did. So, did you work with a certain team? Use a particular piece of software? Did you form a detailed plan? Those are the things your interviewer wants to know, not I worked really hard and it was a great success. That's very broad. That's not giving them specific actions to answer the question. And then lastly, the result. This is your time to shine and explain how you made a positive difference. The final portion of your response should share the results of the action you took. So, the results should be positive. Otherwise, it may not be a story you want to tell. That doesn't mean that you can't tell stories about problems or challenges, and you may be asked that. Tell me about a time where you were challenged. But even if you're talking about a time that you failed or that you were challenged or made a mistake, make sure you end on a high note by talking about what you learned or the steps that you took to improve, because we all make mistakes, but what's really important is how we overcome those. And so for the result, many candidates will skip over this crucial final part of their response and are not clear in how their action made an impact. And this is the most important part of your answer. So, they want to know why it mattered, why what you did was important. So make sure you hammer home the point about any results you achieved and quantify when you can, because numbers are they add credibility and are very impactful. So we're going to look at an example of a STAR story. So this question that we're going to use for our example is, give me an example of a time you were able to be creative with your work. So putting this into action, the situation. Last spring, I was the marketing and communications intern for the Louisville Bats, where I oversaw the organization's social media accounts. So you're telling the interviewer what your position was, where you were interning, and what your responsibilities were. So for the task, you want to explain what you initiated, what was the assignment. So for example, I was tasked with creating a strategic marketing plan for Instagram and Twitter, which the Bats would implement over the summer baseball season. Their goal was to increase attendance for 20 to 30-year-olds. Even though the organization had utilized Twitter before, they had just created their Instagram account and had yet to establish a following. As such, my work was foundational in the implementation of their social media brand. So as an intern, you were set out, they wanted to increase the attendance of 20 to 30-year-olds. So that was your goal, and that was the task that was set out to accomplish. So for the action, this is where you want to be clear in the steps that you took to reach that goal. So, for example, in order to do this, I first researched the target audiences for each social media platform in order to better understand what I would bring them to sporting events. So through that research, I determined that 20 to 30-year-olds viewed sporting events as social gatherings where they could come and have good food and drinks on a small budget. So with that information, I developed new marketing content that highlighted dollar hot dog and dollar beer nights, and I created new marketing materials targeting local businesses and networking groups. And then for the results, you want to wow them and see, you know, what you did, what happened with that. So after implementing my marketing plan, ticket sales for 20 to 30-year-olds went up by 23%, helping the Bats set a season ticket sales record. I'm excited to utilize my research skills and experience with social media to increase your brand awareness too. So this gives the interviewer a clear picture of your skills, your strengths, and your accomplishments, and leads them to believe you'll do the same for their organization too. So the STAR technique is going to give you that framework to navigate those behavioral questions, but you'll need to brainstorm on your own accomplishments and kind of take a walk back and look at some of those things, and then also the challenges, and practice in advance and see how you can structure these using the STAR method. And ultimately those behavioral interviews again are going to indicate what you did in the past and how you're going to implement those in the future role. So Maddie, do we have any questions on the STAR technique or behavioral questions?
We do. What should I do if I can't think of a situation regarding the behavioral question that's asked of me?
Okay, yeah, so I would always suggest that before you go on an interview to prepare by thinking about what are some, again, accomplishments, what are some situations and challenges, so that you have some of these STAR stories ready to go. But if you are in the interview and they ask you something that you simply don't have experience in, or you don't have an example to share, it is okay, though not ideal, to answer that question by saying, this is what I would do. So you can at least demonstrate that you have the knowledge and the skills to effectively navigate those situations. So that would be the best probably way to do that if you can't come up with an example or a similar situation, is to address that from a standpoint of, while I have not been in a situation like this, if I were to encounter this, this is what I would do.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the best way to answer the question, what are your weaknesses?
Oh, I love that question. Yeah, so, if you're asked that directly, or whether or not you're asked, tell me about a time when you're challenged, you need to know what your weaknesses are, because these are areas of opportunity for improvement. And that's the way I like to positively spin the weakness. So a good way to do this is, I think a lot of times we might have been taught to give them a strength and then make it a weakness. And that's not as genuine. So a lot of times I've heard them say, well, I'm a perfectionist. And that is often a good thing to have. That's a strength, since that you are dedicated to excellence. But we all have areas of weakness. We all have areas that we want to grow in. So I think it's good to know and examine those, and it's different for everyone. But the best way to answer that is to share what your weakness may be and ways that you have worked to overcome those. So for instance, maybe your weakness is that you may struggle with time management. So in my past work, I have had difficulties, or I've had challenges with managing my time. One of the things that I have done to keep myself on track is I utilize an online calendar, to where I out each day what I need to do, how long I need to work on that, and when I need to move on. So you're sharing something that is genuinely an area that you're looking to improve in, and you're sharing with them how you're working to address that. So just, kind of do some self-reflection on what is it that you need to grow in, and what are you doing to grow in that. And that would be how I would handle that. Yeah.
We have a question from a student who participated in a phone interview and was told they would hear back soon. They've already reached out to the recruiter about a week ago. When is it okay to reach out again?
So if you've had a phone interview, and again, we're going to close up on the post-interview etiquette, but you should always, even after a phone interview, send a nice thank you email and reiterate, your gratitude for the opportunity and that kind of thing. But once you've done that, you wait to hear, and if you might follow up one more time or so, but at some point, you've got to have other options. You can't bank on just one job. So you don't want to keep following up with someone that can work, negatively against you. I would say sending a thank you email and a follow-up is a good protocol to follow. And at that point, again, I always encourage my students to follow that kind of framework, but to always pursue other options as well. So don't bank on one job. You have to give yourself some options, and you have to acknowledge that maybe you did a good job, but maybe there was someone that was a little bit more qualified. And I do think it's unfortunate that sometimes they'll say that they'll let you know, but often that's not the case. You're going to be left hanging in a lot of situations, and they don't let you know. All you can do is express your interest by following up, and then you have to move forward.
Okay, we have one final question. Could I ask the interviewer, are internships or volunteer opportunities available if I don't get the job, or does that show them a lack of confidence?
That's a really good question. I don't think that, I would say or frame it in that if I don't get the job, because that does somewhat give a sense that you may not be competent. But I would always, my general rule is don't ask any questions that are on the website. So for instance, if you go onto their website, they're probably, if they have volunteer or internship, specifically volunteer, they'll probably have that listed. And so it's just a good practice to never ask a question that's available and on the website. But you could ask, in addition to this opportunity, do you all have opportunities for additional opportunities for volunteer or internship experience? I think that would be fine, but I don't think I would say if I don't get the job. That's a good question.
Thank you, Mallory. That is all the questions.
Well, we're coming in on the home stretch, so I've just got one last piece to share. It's that post-interview etiquette. This is the last step often, and once you've completed your interview, always send a thank you email to your interviewer within that 24 hours. You want to send a personalized thank you to thank them, not only for their time, but also remind them why you're a good fit for the position. And if you've interviewed with multiple individuals, send each of them a thank you note and make it personal to each of them. And if you really want to stand out, you can also mail a formal thank you letter in addition to your email thank you note. And this is important because it shows common courtesy and respect for their time. It helps you stand out because so few other applicants will do this. It showcases your written communication skills, attention to detail, And it provides an opportunity for you to reiterate points made during your interview, emphasize skills or experience you wish you had mentioned, or clean up any rough spots you might have had. And you could also use this as an opportunity to maybe inquire about volunteer or internship opportunities as well. So don't forget this piece to your interview process. It's very, very important. And I know we're closing in on the hour, so if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to your career coach. You can make an appointment with us on Handshake, and also register for our next workshop. It is on July 21st at noon. It's going to be on our new partnership with Parker Dewey, and these are going to talk. Maddie's going to be talking with us about micro internships and how those might be a good opportunity for you to get some experience. Follow us at U of L Careers, and don't forget to check out our website for our recorded workshops. And we hope you all have learned a lot from this workshop today, and have a great day. Thank you.